I knocked on my neighbor's door at midnight to return her cat. She said, "Stay for dinner, my husband's gone." I should have said no. I didn't. That was the night everything changed. The rain that night was the kind that doesn't ask permission. It hammered the windows, flooded the gutters, and turned the city below into a blurred painting no one asked for. I was sitting on my couch at 10 past midnight, laptop open, reading the same paragraph of a contract proposal for the 4th time without understanding a single word when I heard it. Scratching. Not loud, not aggressive, just small, desperate, rhythmic scratching. The sound of something that had been outside for too long and was running out of options. I told myself to ignore it. I made it about 40 seconds before I walked to the balcony door. The moment I slid it open, a blast of cold, wet air hit my face, and a white cat shot between my legs and straight into my apartment like it owned the place. I spun around. It was already sitting on my coffee table, soaking wet, shaking slightly, staring at me with the calm, unbothered expression that only cats and very confident people can manage. "Okay," I said out loud to no one. "Sure." I grabbed a dry towel from the bathroom and wrapped it around the animal before it could protest. That's when I noticed the collar. Thin red leather, simple silver tag. I turned it over. One line, no name, just an apartment number. 8B. I lived in 8A. I stood there for a moment, holding a wet, trembling cat in a towel at midnight, rain still pouring outside, and thought about the kind of night this was turning into. The hallway between our doors was maybe 8 feet long. I knocked twice and stepped back, half expecting no answer. It was midnight after all. But the door opened almost immediately, like someone had been standing just behind it, not quite sleeping, not quite awake. She was wearing an oversized grey sweater that fell past her hips, her dark hair loose and slightly messy in the way that suggested she hadn't been anywhere that day that required it to be otherwise. She was holding a phone in one hand and looked at me with that split-second expression people wear right before relief replaces panic. Eyes wide, breath caught just slightly. Then she saw the white bundle in my arms. "Oh my God. Miso." She exhaled the name more than said it and immediately reached for the cat, who pressed itself against her neck with zero loyalty to the person who had just spent 20 minutes drying it off. "Found her on my balcony," I said. "Probably slipped through the railing gap." "She does that," the woman said, her voice settling now that the crisis was resolved. "I've told the building manager 3 times about that gap." She paused and looked up at me properly for the first time. "I'm sorry, I didn't... Thank you, really." "No problem." I turned to leave. "Hey!" I stopped. She was standing in the doorway, cat tucked under one arm, looking at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Not flirtatious, not calculated. Just like someone standing at the edge of a decision, working out whether to jump. "Stay for dinner," she said. Then, almost as an afterthought, the part that was supposed to make it sound less significant than it was. "My husband's gone for the week anyway." I don't know why I said yes. Maybe it was the rain. Maybe it was the paragraph I'd read 4 times. Maybe it was the way she said anyway, casually, like it was nothing, like it wasn't the most loaded word in the sentence. I said yes. The apartment was beautiful in the way that expensive things sometimes are, technically perfect, emotionally hollow. White walls, clean lines, furniture that looked like it had been chosen by someone with excellent taste and very little attachment. There were no coffee rings on the glass table, no pile of books on the floor. No chaos, no clutter, no evidence that anyone had ever truly relaxed here. It felt like a showroom that someone forgot to leave. She reheated pasta she'd clearly made earlier, enough for 1 stretched into 2, and poured 2 glasses of red wine without asking if I wanted any. I noticed she'd already had half a glass before I arrived. The bottle was sitting on the kitchen counter with the intimacy of something opened early in a quiet evening. We talked. That was the part I didn't expect. Not the apartment, not the wine, not even the cat, but the conversation. Easy in a way that felt almost suspicious, like two people who had known each other in some previous version of their lives and were now just catching up. She asked questions that weren't polite filler. I answered in a way I didn't usually bother to. She laughed at things that were genuinely funny and didn't perform laughter at things that weren't. Her name was Evelyn. At some point past 1 in the morning, I realized I'd been there for over an hour and neither of us had made any move to end the evening. I stood up eventually, out of obligation more than anything else. She walked me to the door. As I stepped into the hallway, something on the wall caught my eye. A framed photograph near the entryway. A gala of some kind. Evelyn in a deep blue dress, radiant, the kind of beautiful that cameras love. Beside her, a tall man with a broad smile and sharp jaw, the kind of man who looked like every room had been designed for him to walk into. They were standing close, posed perfectly. But they weren't touching, not even slightly. Not a hand at the back, not a shoulder leaning in. Two people arranged beside each other with the practiced, invisible distance of people who had stopped reaching for each other a long time ago. "Good night," Evelyn said softly from behind me. I looked away from the photo. "Good night," I said. I walked the 8 feet back to my door, stepped inside, and stood in the quiet of my own apartment for a long moment. Then I looked at the damp towel still sitting on my coffee table. And I already knew, the way you know things you wish you didn't, that returning that cat had just changed something. I just didn't know yet how much. The cat came back the next morning. I was standing at my kitchen counter, still in yesterday's t-shirt, waiting for coffee to finish brewing, when I heard a soft sound at my front door. Not knocking, something lower, closer to the ground. I opened the door. Miso sat in the hallway, perfectly composed, looking up at me like she had an appointment. I stared at her. She stared back. "You live next door," I told her. She walked inside anyway. I let her, because apparently that was who I was now, a man who accepted uninvited guests without argument at 7 in the morning. I gave her a small bowl of water, which she ignored completely, and then watched her circle my couch twice before settling on the one cushion I always sat on. I drank my coffee standing up. Evelyn knocked about 20 minutes later, slightly breathless, hair pulled back in a loose knot, wearing a jacket like she'd been about to leave for somewhere. "I am so sorry," she said the moment I opened the door. "She keeps doing this. I don't know how she gets out. I've checked every window." "Balcony door," I said. "Probably. There's a gap in the partition between ours." She blinked. "That's embarrassing. I've been imagining her squeezing through some impossible crack in the wall like a ghost." "She's smarter than that." "She's smarter than most people I know." She leaned against the doorframe and looked past me at Miso, who had not moved from my cushion. "She also clearly has no loyalty." "None," I agreed. She smiled, and then, because neither of us said anything for a moment, and the silence wasn't uncomfortable enough to fill, she said, "I was going to get coffee downstairs. If you haven't had any, well, if you want." I had already had coffee. I was holding the mug. "Sure," I said. The cafe on the ground floor of our building was small and slightly too warm and smelled like cardamom and steamed milk. We took a corner table near the window and watched the morning street outside. Delivery bikes, school runs, a man arguing passionately with a parking meter. That was how the next few days quietly rearranged themselves. Evelyn would find a small reason. Miso escaping was the most reliable one, but there were others. A jar she couldn't open, a question about the building's Wi-Fi password, a recommendation for a dry cleaner nearby. Each reason was thin enough that we both understood what it actually was. Not a reason at all, just a door left slightly ajar. I kept walking through it. I told myself it was just neighborly, friendly, the kind of easy company two adults could share without it meaning anything complicated. I was almost convincing. On the 4th day, We ended up at a cafe 3 blocks from the building, farther than necessary, which neither of us mentioned. She was telling me something about a gallery exhibit she'd been following when she stopped mid-sentence, looked at her coffee cup, and said something she clearly hadn't planned to say. "I went 8 days last month without having a real conversation with anyone." The table went quiet. Not awkward quiet, the other kind, the kind that settles over something honest. 8 days, I said. Marcus travels every week. Sometimes it's 3 days, sometimes it's 6. She turned her cup slowly in her hands. I have friends, technically. We text. We like each other's photos. But sitting down, actually talking? She paused. I don't know. It started feeling like too much effort to organize. And then I stopped trying as much. And then 8 days passed and I realized I'd spoken more words to Miso than to any human being. She said it lightly, the way people do when they're testing whether something is safe to say out loud. Like if she smiled at the end of it, it would stay manageable. I didn't laugh it off. That sounds lonely, I said simply. She looked up from her cup. Something shifted in her expression. Not dramatically, not in a way that would show up in a photograph, just a small, almost imperceptible softening around her eyes. Like she'd been holding her shoulders up slightly for a very long time and had just, for 1 second, let them drop. It is, she said quietly. I keep waiting for it to feel less so, but it's like, you know when a room goes dark so gradually that you don't notice until you're sitting in the complete dark and you can't quite remember when the light changed? I knew exactly what she meant. I also knew, in that moment, that this was no longer about coffee, or a borrowed cat, or a jar that wouldn't open. That night, back in my apartment, I sat with my laptop open and the same unfinished proposal on screen, and didn't read a single word. I kept thinking about the way she'd said, "it is," not defensively, not dramatically, just plainly, like a fact she'd finally decided deserved to be said in full rather than swallowed. I thought about the photograph by her front door, the careful, untouching distance between 2 people who used to choose each other. I thought about 8 days. I closed my laptop. Miso was asleep on my cushion again. I didn't have the heart to move her. I sat on the floor instead and stared at the ceiling and told myself, very firmly, that I was going to stop thinking about my neighbor. I was already failing. It was Evelyn's idea. She texted on a Saturday morning, casual, almost throwaway. There's a street book fair near Calendar Square today. I was going to go alone, but that's a bit sad, even for me. Come if you want. I read it twice. The "even for me" was doing a lot of work in that sentence. Self-aware enough to be funny, honest enough to sting slightly. I typed back a single word. When? The fair had taken over 4 blocks of the old Market Street. Wooden stalls packed with second-hand paperbacks, vintage maps, hand-bound journals, and the kind of obscure coffee table books that exist entirely to be flipped through and never purchased. It was the sort of place that felt aggressively charming, like the city was trying to remind you it still had personality beneath all the glass and steel. Evelyn was already there when I arrived, standing at a stall of old travel books, holding a battered guide to Lisbon from 1987, with the concentrated expression of someone making an extremely important decision. "You're not actually going to buy that," I said, coming up beside her. She didn't look up. "It has handwritten notes in the margins. Someone went to every single restaurant listed and wrote whether it was still open or not." "In 1987. "In 1987, she confirmed seriously. "So none of them are open anymore. But the handwriting is beautiful." She bought it. We moved through the fair the way you move through places that have no agenda, slowly, doubling back, letting things catch our attention without apology. She had opinions about everything, strong ones, delivered without performance. She hated books with foil covers on principle. She believed paperback spines should be cracked immediately upon purchase. She once read an entire novel standing in a bookshop over 4 separate visits because she refused to buy it on suspicion, and couldn't confirm whether it deserved her shelf space without finishing it first. "That's either very principled or deeply antisocial," I told her. "Both," she said pleasantly. "Most interesting things are." We ate from food trucks, spiced flatbread from one, mango slices dusted with chili from another, and wandered into the crowd without any particular direction. The city felt loose and unhurried around us. She laughed easily. I noticed I did too, in a way that wasn't calculated, wasn't social obligation, wasn't the version of laughing you perform for people you're still figuring out. This felt like the version that happens when you stop paying attention to yourself. The afternoon tipped toward evening without asking. The streetlights were beginning to assert themselves against the fading sky when we finally turned back toward home. The crowd had thinned. The stalls were packing up around us, wooden crates being loaded, unsold books returning to wherever unsold books spent their nights. We walked side by side on the narrow pavement and talked about nothing in particular. A film she'd watched twice and couldn't decide if she liked, a neighborhood I'd lived in before this one, the specific misery of assembling furniture alone at 11 at night. And then, our hands almost touched. Not dramatically, not like a scene in a film where the music swells and the camera slows. Just the natural accidental proximity of two people walking close enough that their knuckles grazed once, and then again. And both times we adjusted, slightly, instinctively, the way you move away from something warm before you've consciously decided to. We didn't talk about it. We kept walking. But the conversation went quieter, and something else moved into the space where the words had been. Something that neither of us was willing to name yet, but both of us could feel pressing at the edges of the evening like weather moving in. We were half a block from the building when she stopped walking. Not fully, just slowed, the way people do when something is trying to come out and they're deciding whether to let it. She was looking ahead, not at me, at some middle distance where the streetlight caught the edge of the wet pavement. Then she said it. "I forgot what it feels like when someone actually notices me." She didn't say it like a confession. She said it like a quiet observation, like something she'd found in a drawer she hadn't opened in a long time and was now holding up to the light, unsure what to do with it. I didn't say anything, not because I had nothing to say, but because everything I could have said felt either too small for the moment or too large for where we were supposed to be standing. So we just stood there for a second, in the amber light, with the book fair folding up behind us and the city moving around us the way cities do, indifferent, continuous, unbothered by the small, enormous things happening at street level. Then she smiled faintly, shifted the Lisbon book under her arm, and started walking again. I walked beside her. We didn't almost touch again, but that sentence followed me all the way up the elevator, down the hallway, through my front door, and straight into the sleepless middle of the night, where it sat, quiet and stubborn and impossible to put away. I forgot what it feels like when someone actually notices me. 7 words. I kept turning them over like a stone with something written on the other side that I wasn't sure I was ready to read yet. Marcus came back on a Monday. I knew before I saw him. I heard the elevator open with that particular heaviness of someone arriving with luggage, the specific thud of a wheeled suitcase being pulled down a hallway, the brief pause outside a door, the sound of a key that knows exactly where it belongs. I was in my kitchen when I heard it through the shared wall. I stood very still for a moment, holding a glass of water, listening to nothing in particular. Then I put the glass down and went back to what I was doing. I met him that evening. Evelyn knocked on my door around 7, which itself felt different, more formal, more deliberate than the casual knocks of the past week. She was dressed properly, hair down, lipstick, the kind of effortful put-together that told me she'd been preparing.
"Marcus is back,"
she said, in the tone of someone providing a weather update. "We're doing dinner if you'd like to join. He wanted to meet the neighbor who found miso." The way she said "the neighbor who found miso," careful, cleanly defined, told me everything about the version of me she needed me to be tonight. "Sure," I said. Marcus opened the wine before I sat down. He was exactly what the photograph had suggested. Tall, broad-shouldered, the kind of effortlessly composed that comes from spending years in rooms where everyone is watching. He had a firm handshake and held eye contact just long enough to make it feel like a statement. His suit jacket was draped over a chair. His watch caught the light when he moved. "So, you saved our girl," he said, nodding at Miso, who was sitting on the kitchen windowsill with her usual indifference to human drama. "She saved herself mostly," I said. "I just opened the door." He laughed, easy, practiced, and poured 3 glasses. "Evelyn says you two have been getting acquainted this week." "The building has good coffee," I said. "It does," he agreed, without looking at her. Dinner was a performance in 3 acts. Evelyn had cooked, something with salmon and capers and what looked like considerable effort. She brought dishes out with the quiet efficiency of someone who had learned to make hosting look effortless so that no one would notice how much it cost her. Marcus complimented the food once, briefly, then picked up his phone. Not conspicuously, not rudely in any way he would have recognized as rude, just the habitual, low-grade distraction of someone who has stopped treating a table as a place where presence is required. A glance, a scroll, a message typed quickly under the table like a reflex. Evelyn noticed. She always noticed. She just didn't say anything. I watched her refill his wine without being asked and mention, carefully, the gallery exhibit she'd been planning to attend that weekend. The one she told me about 3 times with genuine excitement, describing the artist, the themes, the way she'd been following his work for 2 years. Marcus nodded, with his eyes still on his phone. "Sounds good, yeah," he said. She stopped talking about it. There was a pause, just a beat, just a fraction of silence where her enthusiasm had been. She smoothed it over quickly with a question about his trip. He answered at length. She listened with her full attention. I noticed that her wine glass stayed nearly full all evening. After dinner, Marcus settled into the armchair with the natural authority of someone returning to a throne briefly vacated, and asked me the kind of questions that successful men ask when they're assessing rather than connecting. What I did, where I'd worked before, whether I owned or rented. I answered honestly and briefly. He seemed mildly satisfied. At one point he mentioned, not unkindly, just offhandedly, that Evelyn had been a bit cooped up lately, and it was good she'd had some company while he was away. Cooped up, like a weather condition, like something that had happened to her rather than something she'd been quietly living inside of. I glanced at Evelyn. She was looking at her plate. I left just past 9. Evelyn walked me to the elevator the way she had the first night, and the familiarity of that small gesture felt suddenly complicated in a way it hadn't before. We stood in the hallway, with the apartment door closed behind us. She didn't say anything for a moment. Then she looked up with an expression I recognized, the one that meant something real was about to be said, in a way that made it sound like nothing. "See?" she said quietly, almost embarrassed. "Nothing dramatic. Just lonely." 4 words that landed harder than she probably intended. I wanted to say something. Something that acknowledged what I'd just witnessed. The forgotten wine, the interrupted story, the way she'd made herself smaller all evening so that the room felt more comfortable for everyone else. But the elevator arrived. I stepped inside. She stayed in the hallway. The doors closed between us, and I rode down alone, staring at my own reflection in the polished metal, slightly distorted, uncertain at the edges, just lonely. Marcus wasn't a villain. That was the part that made it complicated. He was just a man who had stopped paying attention. Slowly, gradually, the way lights dim, until the woman across the dinner table had become part of the furniture of his life rather than the reason for it. And somehow, that was worse. The cancellation came at 4:47 p.m. I know the time because I was in the hallway checking my mail when I heard it through Evelyn's door. Not the words, just the tone. The specific, flattening quiet that follows a phone call that has taken something away. I almost knocked. I stood there for a full 10 seconds with my hand raised and then walked back to my apartment instead, because it wasn't my door to knock on. She knocked on mine 20 minutes later. She was still holding her phone. She'd gotten dressed for the evening. A deep green dress, hair pinned back, small gold earrings that caught the light when she moved. She looked like someone who had prepared carefully for something and was now standing in the wreckage of that preparation, trying to decide whether to laugh or cry about it. "He's not coming," she said. "Conference call that apparently couldn't wait until Monday." "I'm sorry." "It's fine." She said it the way people say things that are not fine, but have been said so many times they've worn smooth. The exhibit closes Sunday, and I've been talking about this artist for months. I don't know if I want to go alone." I got my jacket. The gallery was in a converted warehouse on the east side of the city. Exposed brick, high ceilings, the kind of industrial space that somehow made art feel more urgent. The exhibit was called Interior Distances. Large canvases, dense, layered paintings that looked almost abstract until you stood close enough to see that every single one contained a figure, a person, somewhere inside the chaos of color and texture, half hidden, present but obscured. Evelyn stopped at the first one and didn't move for a long time. I watched her more than I watched the paintings. That was when I saw it. The version of her she kept stored somewhere beneath the careful politeness and the effortful hosting and the quietly swallowed disappointments. Standing in front of that first canvas, with her arms loosely crossed and her head tilted slightly, she looked completely alive, lit from the inside. She spoke about the work with a precision and passion that had no performance in it whatsoever. She wasn't explaining for my benefit. She was just thinking out loud, following the thread of something that genuinely moved her. She noticed things I would have walked past. The deliberate asymmetry, the way the artist buried warmth under cold layers so you had to earn it with your eyes. The recurring motif of doors in the background, always slightly open, never fully. "He paints longing," she said simply, in front of the 7th canvas. "Not the dramatic kind, the quiet kind. The kind that just sits in the corner of a room and waits." I didn't say anything. She glanced at me sideways. "Too much?" "No," I said. "Exactly right." We stayed until the gallery closed at 9. Outside, the city had changed its mood entirely. The temperature had dropped, and the sky had made a decision. Fat, cold drops beginning just as we reached the street, accelerating quickly into the kind of rain that makes umbrellas feel pointless. We ran half a block before accepting defeat and ducking under the narrow awning of a restaurant that had already pulled its outdoor tables inside. We stood pressed against the wall, shoulders nearly touching, watching the rain turn the street into something reflective and slightly cinematic. She was slightly breathless from running, laughing at the sudden absurdity of it, the green dress, the gold earrings, standing under 8 inches of canvas awning while the sky came down around us. Then the laughter faded, and what replaced it was something quieter and considerably more dangerous. We stood there for a long time, long enough that the silence stopped feeling accidental and started feeling chosen. Then Evelyn said, "I keep waiting for him to notice." She wasn't looking at me. She was watching a taxi cut through a deep puddle. "Notice what?" I asked, though I already knew. "That I'm unhappy." She said it plainly, no drama, no tears, just a fact offered to the rain. Not miserable, not broken, just unhappy. In the quiet way, the way that doesn't make a sound so nobody hears it. She paused. I keep thinking if I wait long enough, he'll look up from whatever he's doing and see it on my face. But he never does. The rain intensified briefly, drumming against the awning above us. I think about you, I said. It came out before I decided to say it. Not impulsively. It had been true for long enough that it simply ran out of room to stay inside. She turned to look at me then, really look, the way she looked at the paintings. I know, she said softly. I think about you too. That's the problem. Neither of us moved. We didn't kiss. We didn't close the distance. We just stood in the thin shelter of that awning with the rain surrounding us on three sides and looked at each other with the full, honest weight of what we'd just admitted. It wasn't a beginning, exactly, but it wasn't nothing either. It was the moment before, that suspended, irreversible second when a door you've been standing in front of swings open, and even though you haven't walked through yet, you both know the choice has already been made. And from that moment, quietly, everything changed. Nobody announces the moment they cross a line. That's the thing nobody tells you. There's no alarm, no dramatic pause where the world stops and asks if you're sure. You just look up one day and realize you're already standing somewhere you promised yourself you wouldn't go. And the worst part is you can trace every small, reasonable step that brought you there. It started with mornings. Coffee had become a ritual without either of us officially making it one. 8 o'clock, sometimes 8:30. The cafe downstairs, or the one 3 blocks away, or occasionally just my kitchen counter, with 2 mugs and the city waking up outside the window. We talked about everything and nothing in the way that only works between people who have stopped trying to impress each other. Then it became phone calls, long ones, late ones, the kind that start as a quick question and somehow end an hour and a half later when one of us notices the time and feels vaguely guilty about it. She'd call from the bedroom when Marcus was already asleep. I'd answer every time, always, without pretending to consider whether I should. Then lunches. Different neighborhoods each time. Not to be secretive, we told ourselves, just for variety. We were lying, of course. We both knew it. We just didn't say it. Miso had fully adopted my apartment as a second residence by this point. She had a preferred cushion, a water bowl I'd stopped putting away, and the absolute confidence of an animal that knows it is wanted. Evelyn would joke that the cat had better instincts than both of us. She wasn't wrong. The twist came from a direction neither of us expected. Marcus started trying. It began subtly. He came home one Tuesday with flowers. Not occasion flowers, not apology flowers, just flowers, sitting on the kitchen counter when Evelyn got back from a walk, with a small card that said nothing more than, "Thought of you today." She told me about it at lunch the next day, with an expression I couldn't entirely read. "That's the first time in 2 years," she said, stirring her coffee slowly, "that he's done something with no reason attached to it." "How did it feel?" I asked. She was quiet for a moment. "Confusing," she said finally. "Which is its own kind of sad, isn't it? That something that should feel simple now feels confusing." I nodded and said nothing, because what I was feeling underneath that nod was something I wasn't proud of, a small, selfish tightening in my chest. Not happiness for her, the opposite. Marcus kept going. He booked a dinner reservation at a restaurant she'd mentioned once, months ago, in passing, the kind of detail most people forget. He came home 2 days earlier than scheduled on a Thursday and suggested they watch a film together, something she'd been talking about since January. He was paying attention suddenly, clumsily, belatedly, but genuinely. And I watched Evelyn caught in the undertow of it. Some evenings, she'd text me something warm and easy. Other evenings, the messages stopped entirely, and I knew, without needing to ask, that Marcus had come home, and the apartment that usually felt empty was full again. Those silences were louder than anything she could have said. I started hating the better version of Marcus. That was the honest truth, and I'm not going to dress it up. The neglectful version had been easier to understand, easier to position myself against without guilt. But this version, the one bringing flowers and remembering restaurant names and trying, however imperfectly, to repair something he'd let erode, that version had no clear villain slot to fill. He wasn't abusive. He wasn't cruel. He was just a man who had taken something precious for granted for so long that he'd nearly lost it and was now scrambling to understand what he'd almost let slip through his hands. I understood the feeling more than I wanted to admit. One afternoon, I walked past a bookshop window and saw a display of travel books and thought immediately of the 1987 Lisbon guide she'd bought at the street fair. No reason, no prompt, just the automatic, helpless way your mind roots itself towards someone it's been spending too much time with. I kept walking. That evening, I sat with a drink and tried to have an honest conversation with myself. What exactly was I doing? We hadn't kissed. Nothing physical had happened. Every line in that department remained technically intact. But I knew, with the uncomfortable clarity of someone who can no longer afford self-deception, that what was happening between us had nothing to do with technicalities. Emotional intimacy, built slowly and quietly over weeks, can be more consuming than anything physical. It occupies more space. It's harder to put down. I had learned the shape of her silences. I knew which laugh was real and which was polite. I knew she always ordered what she actually wanted and never adjusted for other people's opinions. I knew she was braver than she believed herself to be. That kind of knowing doesn't arrive without cost. The guilt arrived properly that night. Not abstract guilt, the specific, grinding kind. Because Marcus wasn't monstrous, Evelyn wasn't reckless, and I wasn't innocent. We were just three people in the same orbit, each one lonely in a different direction. And somewhere in the middle of all that loneliness, something had quietly caught fire. The only question now was whether anyone would try to put it out. They left on a Friday morning. I heard the taxi from my window, the brief sound of luggage being loaded, two voices, a door closing. I didn't look down at the street. I just stood at the window with my coffee and listened to the taxi pull away, and then stood there a little longer after the sound had gone completely. The apartment next door went quiet in a way that felt different from its usual quiet, like a held breath instead of a resting one. I told myself this was good, a weekend anniversary trip, a proper attempt at reconnection. Two people choosing to try. That was the right ending to this story, and I should want it for them. I spent Friday convincing myself I did. Saturday was worse. I worked for most of the morning with the focused intensity of someone trying to occupy every available corner of their mind. I went to the gym in the afternoon. I called my brother for the first time in 6 weeks and talked for 40 minutes about nothing in particular, laughing at the right moments, present enough that he didn't notice I wasn't fully there. In the evening, I sat on my balcony with a drink and watched the city do what cities do on Saturday nights. Fill up, spill over, hum with the collective energy of people who had somewhere to be. Miso was inside on my cushion. Even she seemed quieter than usual. I checked my phone twice, put it face down both times. No messages. Which was right. Which was exactly how it should be. Sunday arrived with grey skies and the particular restlessness of a day that doesn't know what it wants to be. I cleaned my apartment with the aggressive thoroughness of a man trying to outrun his own thoughts. Reorganized the bookshelf by no system in particular. Made a proper lunch instead of something convenient. Sat down to read and managed 4 pages before I realized I hadn't absorbed a single sentence. By late afternoon, I had fully, rationally, and completely convinced myself to let it go. Whatever this thing was, this slow, consuming, dangerous thing that had been building in coffee shops and gallery hallways and late-night phone calls, it needed to end cleanly, before it became something nobody could come back from. Evelyn had a life, a marriage that was, imperfectly and belatedly, showing signs of repair. A husband who had started bringing flowers and remembering restaurant names. That had to mean something. I deserved to want something uncomplicated. She deserved the chance to fix what she had without my presence making it harder. Clean endings weren't the same as easy ones. I was certain of all of this by 9 o'clock on Sunday night. The knock came at 11:47. 3 soft knocks, not urgent, not aggressive. Almost hesitant, like the hand that made them had paused between each one. I already knew before I opened the door. Evelyn was standing in the hallway in a grey sweater I hadn't seen before, crumpled slightly, like she'd been sitting in it for hours. Her eyes were dry, but the kind of dry that comes after, not before. The kind that means everything has already happened, and what's left is just the wreckage, and the silence, and the long drive home. She didn't say anything immediately, neither did I. She came inside and sat on the couch, and I sat in the chair across from her, and the apartment held the two of us in the kind of quiet that doesn't need to be filled. Miso appeared from somewhere and jumped up beside her, pressing against her leg without drama, the way animals do when they understand something without being told. Then, slowly, she talked. The trip had failed, not dramatically, nothing thrown, nothing shouted, just the quiet, grinding failure of two people sitting in a beautiful lake house, realizing they'd brought all their problems with them and left all their solutions at home. Marcus had taken 3 work calls on Saturday morning, then 2 more in the afternoon. She'd sat by the lake alone for 2 hours watching the water and waiting for him to come find her. He hadn't. That evening she'd finally said it, plainly, without accusation, just the truth, laid out like something she'd carried too long and needed to set down. That she was lonely, that she had been for years, that she needed him to actually be present, not just nearby. Marcus had listened. Then he'd said, carefully, with the reasonable tone of a man who believed he was being very fair, that she was being too sensitive, that he was working for their future, that marriage stress was normal, and she needed to give it time. Give it time. After years of waiting, he'd asked for more time. She looked at me from across the room, and I saw it. Not the composure she usually maintained, not the managed sadness I'd watched her carry through dinners and galleries and rainy street awnings. Something underneath all of that, raw and exhausted and done. She crossed the room. She kissed me. It lasted only a moment, brief, desperate, honest, and then she pulled back and pressed her hand over her mouth, and the guilt arrived in her eyes so fast and so completely that it was almost physical to watch. "I'm sorry," she whispered. I never wanted to be this person." I reached forward and held her hand. "I know," I said quietly. "I know exactly who you are." She cried then, not loudly, just the slow, exhausted release of someone who had held everything together for so long that the holding itself had become the heaviest part. And sitting there, in the quiet of my apartment, with the city outside and the cat pressed between us, I understood that the gray area we'd been living in was gone. Whatever came next had to be honest, even if honest was the hardest direction we could possibly choose. I always assumed, when I let myself think about it, that discovery would arrive like a storm, raised voices through walls, a door slammed hard enough to rattle a frame. The kind of confrontation that announces itself from 3 apartments away and leaves everyone in the building slightly shaken. That's not how it happened. It was a Thursday evening, 11 days after the lake house. Evelyn and I had been careful, deliberately, consciously careful, in a way that felt like its own kind of admission. The morning coffees had stopped. The phone calls had become shorter, less frequent, pulled back from intimacy, the way you pull a hand from a flame, not because you want to, but because you finally accept what fire does. We hadn't talked about the kiss directly. It sat between us in every conversation, like a word in a language neither of us was ready to speak fluently yet. I was at my desk when I heard them. Not shouting, that was the first thing I noticed. Just voices. Marcus's low and controlled, the tone of a man who has rehearsed. Evelyn's steadier than I expected, which told me she'd been anticipating this moment longer than he had. I didn't move closer to the wall. I didn't need to. The walls in this building had always been thinner than the rent suggested. Marcus had found the messages on her phone. Not by searching, he'd said that much clearly, his voice carrying the careful precision of someone trying to establish facts before feelings. Her phone had been on the kitchen counter, a message preview visible, his name not in it. He'd read enough. The messages weren't explicit. There was nothing in them that could be pointed to cleanly and labeled. No declarations, no arrangements, nothing that existed below the surface in language alone. But intimacy doesn't require explicit language to be legible. Anyone who has ever been in love can read it in the spaces between sentences, in the rhythm of exchange, in the texture of honesty shared only between two people who have stopped performing for each other. Marcus had read all of that, and he was not stupid. What happened next was the part I hadn't expected. He didn't rage. He didn't issue ultimatums or list grievances or assign blame with the systematic thoroughness of someone building a legal case. He went quiet in a way that sounded heavier than shouting. The quiet of a man standing inside something he had contributed to and was only now beginning to understand. "I thought," he started, then stopped. A long pause. "I thought if I provided everything, that was enough. That was my job, and I was doing it, and that should have been—" Another stop. His voice had lost its rehearsed quality now. What replaced it was something more ragged, more human. "I didn't think you were unhappy. I genuinely didn't see it." Evelyn's response was so quiet, I almost missed it. "I know," she said. "That was the problem." Then she said the thing that had probably been true for years, waiting in the dark for a moment honest enough to hold it. "I stopped feeling loved, Marcus. Not unloved. You never said anything cruel, you never did anything terrible. But there's a kind of invisibility that creeps in when someone stops noticing you. Not your achievements, or your appearance, or your usefulness. Just you. The actual you." A pause. "I've been invisible for a long time." The silence that followed was the longest yet. I sat at my desk and stared at the wall and felt something complicated move through me. Not satisfaction, not vindication, nothing even remotely clean. Just the particular uncomfortable ache of witnessing something real happening to people who had both caused it and been damaged by it in equal measure. Marcus said quietly, "Is it serious? With him?" Evelyn took a moment. "Nothing physical has happened," she said, which was honest as far as it went. "That's not what I asked." Another pause. "I don't know what it is," she said finally, "but I know what we are, and I think we both know it's been broken for longer than either of us wanted to admit." I stood up from my desk and walked to the kitchen and poured a glass of water I didn't drink, because standing in my apartment, listening to the architecture of a marriage disassemble itself on the other side of a wall, I understood something with sudden and uncomfortable clarity. I was not the cause of this, but I was not innocent of it either. Marcus wasn't a villain. He was a man who had confused presence with provision, who had slowly, without malice or intention, made the person he loved feel like a detail in his life, rather than the point of it. Evelyn wasn't reckless. She was a woman who had waited patiently for years in a quiet that nobody came to fill, until someone finally did, and had found, in that filling, something she hadn't known she was still capable of feeling. And I was someone who had walked through every door she left open, telling myself it was innocent, right up until it wasn't. Nobody here was the villain. That was the most difficult thing. 3 people, 3 different shapes of loneliness, 1 shared wreckage. And somewhere on the other side of that wall, the truth was finally, painfully, irreversibly, in the room. The separation happened quietly. That surprised me most. Not the decision itself, but the absence of theater around it. No dramatic exodus, no midnight departure with bags thrown hastily into a taxi. Just 2 adults sitting across from each other in an expensive apartment and arriving, slowly and painfully, at the only honest conclusion available to them. Marcus moved into a hotel first, then a serviced apartment across the city. He did it without bitterness, or if there was bitterness, he kept it somewhere private, which I respected more than I expected to. Evelyn told me about it over the phone, 3 days after the confrontation. Her voice was steady in the way of someone who has already done their crying in private and is now simply reporting facts. "He said he needed time to understand where he went wrong," she told me. "Not to fix it, just to understand it." "That's more self-awareness than most people manage," I said. "I know." A pause. "That's what makes it sad." I stayed away. Not coldly. We spoke, we texted occasionally, the kind of contact that said, "I'm still here," without saying, "Come closer." But I made a deliberate choice in those early months to not become the scaffolding she rebuilt herself against. That felt important. Not for my sake, for hers. Because Evelyn didn't need someone new to lean on. She needed to find out what she looked like standing on her own. And I needed to find out whether what I felt for her was real in the clean light of an uncomplicated world, or whether it had only ever been the particular intensity that grows in stolen hours and borrowed time. Distance was the only honest test. The divorce took several months. No courtroom battles, no contested assets turned into weapons, just the slow, administrative dismantling of a shared life. Lawyers, paperwork, the dividing of things that had been accumulated together, but could be separated without too much damage. Marcus was fair throughout. Evelyn was fair back. They were, in the end, 2 people who had genuinely loved each other once, and were now choosing honesty over ego. I heard later, through a mutual acquaintance, that Marcus had started therapy, that he'd taken a reduced travel schedule at work, that he was, in his own belated way, becoming someone who might have saved the marriage if he'd arrived 5 years earlier. The cruelty of timing. It has no interest in being fair. Evelyn moved out on a Tuesday in late autumn. She didn't ask me to help. She'd arranged it all herself. Movers, a new apartment across the city, the quiet logistics of a woman reclaiming her own life from scratch. When I came home that evening, apartment 8B was empty. The door was propped open, and the rooms beyond it had that particular hollowness of spaces recently vacated. Walls slightly brighter where frames had hung, small indentations in the carpet where furniture had stood for years. Miso was gone too. The hallway felt different after that, shorter somehow, like it had lost its reason for being interesting. Months passed. I redecorated slightly, finished the contract proposal I'd been ignoring since the night a wet white cat scratched at my balcony in the rain, took a trip I'd been postponing, slept properly for the first time in what felt like most of a year. I thought about Evelyn often, but differently. Not with the urgent, consuming frequency of before, but with the quieter, more considered feeling of someone who matters to you in a way that has survived being tested. I didn't reach out. I trusted that if something real existed between us, something built on more than proximity and longing and the specific intimacy of being 2 lonely people in adjacent apartments during a difficult season, it would find its own way back. The rooftop dinner was on a Saturday evening in early spring. Mutual friends, a couple on the 6th floor who hosted seasonal gatherings on the building's communal rooftop, string lights, too much food, the city spread out in every direction like something that had decided, for one evening, to look its best. I arrived late, found a glass of wine pressed into my hand immediately, got pulled into a conversation about something I can't now remember, and then I felt it. The specific, cellular awareness of someone entering a space that you've been unconsciously scanning for without admitting it. I turned around. Evelyn was across the rooftop, laughing at something the woman beside her had said. A real laugh, unguarded, the one I recognized. She looked different, not dramatically, just lighter somehow, like something she'd been carrying in her shoulders for years had finally been set down and left behind. She hadn't seen me yet. I had about 4 seconds of watching her simply exist in a room, happy, present, unburdened, before something warm landed in my lap and shattered the moment completely. Miso. Apparently she'd been brought along. Apparently she still had opinions about where she belonged. I looked down at the cat. The cat looked up at me with the absolute, untroubled confidence of an animal that has never once doubted it made the right choice. Then I looked up. Evelyn had found me across the rooftop. She was looking at me with an expression I'd never seen on her face before. Open, unhurried, uncomplicated by guilt or obligation or the particular sadness of wanting something you shouldn't. Just a smile, clean and honest and entirely her own. I smiled back, and this time, for the first time, there was nothing between us but the spring night, the city lights, and whatever came next. Which, for once, felt like more than enough.